Hi everyone, and welcome to the NARUC NASEO webinar on our briefing reports on microgrid financing and use cases. I'm joined by the two authors, Kira Zettelman and Sam Kramer from NARUC and NASEO respectively. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items and some intro slides, and then I will hand it over to Kira. So these reports were jointly authored by NARUC. NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and they're a nonprofit organization dedicated to representing the state public service commissions, and those regulate utilities that provide essential services such as energy, telecommunications, power, water, and transportation. NARUC's members include all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And most of the commissioners are appointed to their positions, but there are some states, about 1/3, where the commissioners are elected. NARUC's mission is to serve in the public interest by improving the quality and effectiveness of public utility regulations. Kira is part of NARUC's Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and that is NARUC's grant-funded technical assistance office for state PUCs. NASEO is the only national organization whose membership includes the governor-designated energy directors and their offices. Over 3,000 state energy professionals are our members, and they come from each of the 50 states, the territories, and the District of Columbia. We engage with federal energy policy and regulatory officials and private sector energy organizations on behalf of the states. We are structured to include our 6 regions and various topical energy committees. We work on security, electricity, financing, transportation, and equity, to name a few. State energy directors and their offices have broad policy and programming responsibility over all energy sectors, and with over 80% of them having direct access to the governor and/or relevant cabinet secretaries. State energy directors advise and support their governors and state legislators, and 50% of them serve as their governor's energy advisor. Others function in an expert supporting role. In the fall of 2019, NARUC and NASEO initiated a joint microgrid state working group funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity. The microgrid state working group convenes NARUC and NASEO members representing more than 20 states, and we support those states to explore the capabilities, costs, and benefits of microgrids, discuss barriers to microgrid development, and develop strategies with the states to plan, finance, and deploy microgrids to improve resilience. And you can see in the chat, Kira put the links to NARUC's microgrids website as well as the NASEO microgrids website, where you can find more information. Our agenda today is to provide you with an overview of the 2 briefing reports that NASEO and NARUC recently released. The first one on user objectives and design approaches for microgrids, and the second one on private, state, and federal funding and financing options. This will be followed by a Q&A, and then we have a few microgrid state working group announcements. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a few items of housekeeping. If you have a question or need technical assistance, please put that in the questions box, and we will get to your questions at the end. And if there's technical needs, we will address those as we go through the webinar. All attendees are muted, and this webinar will be recorded. We will be posting the slides and the webinar recording on the respective NARUC and NASEO microgrids working group website. If you'd like to download the reports, as I mentioned, you can find them in the chat, the links in the chat. You can find them on NARUC and NASEO's microgrids websites. They will be also linked in the slides that we provide you after the webinar. I would like to introduce the 2 authors of the reports first, and then I will turn it over to Kira to walk us through the first report on user objectives. Kira Zettelman joined NARUC in 2016, where she manages multiple federal cooperative agreements with the U.S. Department of Energy and national labs on such issues as carbon capture and coal-fired power, nuclear energy, natural gas, microgrids, and electricity policy. She provides technical assistance and analytical support to the state public utility commissions. She supports the NARUC committees on gas, electricity, and energy resources and the environment. She holds a BS in environmental policy from the University of Maryland and an MPP from Georgetown University. The other author, Sam Kramer, is NASEO's financing program director, and he supports electricity planning initiatives leads NASEO state energy planning assistance, and conducts research on a range of issues such as energy water, nexus, and commercial property assessed clean energy. Before NASEO, Mr. Kramer worked for the National Governors Association, where he assisted governors' offices with understanding energy topics such as new utility business models, electricity market structures, shale, oil, and gas productive practices, and greenhouse gas emissions rules. He received his Bachelor of Science from Cornell University and his Master of Public Policy from American University. And without further ado, please, Kira, take it away with your report.
Thanks, Kirsten. So I'm going to be providing a summary of the NARUC report on user objectives and design approaches for microgrids. We could go to the next slide. The report is organized. Kirsten, can you advance the slide? Great, thank you. So the report is organized to answer really four main questions. What is a microgrid? What goes into the design of a microgrid? Why are customers procuring microgrids? And how do various objectives and decision points affect the design and operation of a microgrid? Recalling the purposes of this working group that Kirsten just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we felt like achieving a shared understanding of how and why microgrids are developed was an important precursor to discussing barriers and developing strategies to improve the planning, financing, and deployment of microgrids and achieving the mission of our microgrid state working group. So moving to the next slide. One of the common threads that we heard from our microgrid state working group members was that they felt like their state lacked a clear definition of a microgrid. So for the purposes of this paper, we adopted the Department of Energy's Microgrid Exchange Group's definition. A microgrid is a group of interconnected loads and distributed energy resources, DERs, within clearly defined electrical boundaries that acts as a single controllable entity with respect to the grid. A microgrid can connect and disconnect from the grid to enable it to operate in both grid-connected or islanded mode. This differentiates a microgrid from an individual DER or even a combination of DERs. While we found this definition to be useful in covering each component of a microgrid, it does not discuss how many customers or facilities might be connected to a microgrid, which we found to be an important consideration. The New Jersey Board of Public Utilities developed a three-level classification system for microgrids according to number of customers that we also included in this paper. So their three-level system, starting at level 1, a single customer microgrid would be a single DER serving one customer through 1 meter. A level 2, or a single customer campus setting, also known as a partial feeder microgrid, would be a single DER or multiple DERs serving multiple facilities, again controlled by 1 meter. And finally, a level 3, or a multi-customer advanced or full feeder microgrid, is a single DER or multiple DERs serving multiple facilities and customers on multiple meters. The DER or DERs may be located on a different site from the facilities or customers. While the advanced microgrid has one point of common coupling, the individual facilities or customers within the advanced microgrid may have their own individual connections to the distribution grid. Going to the next slide. Based on the DOE definition, we then explored each component of a microgrid. So load, generation, DERs, controls, and interconnection or point of common coupling. So starting with load, the consumer or consumers of electricity, load can be designated as critical, high priority, or low priority. Critical load is uninterruptible, meaning that any disruption of electric service, regardless of duration, is highly costly or may impact human life and safety. This is a load that a microgrid seeks to keep operating 100% of the time. Second, DERs, the supply of electricity. DERs may include generation, energy storage, and load control, such as energy efficiency or demand response technologies located at the distribution level. DERs can be powered by a range of fuels, including diesel, natural gas, solar power, and others. Third, controls, the management system of the microgrid. A microgrid controller performs multiple functions, including identifying when and how to connect and disconnect from the grid, maintaining real and reactive power balance when the microgrid is disconnected and operating in islanded mode, and dispatching DERs to support load. Enforce interconnection, the point at which the microgrid connects to the distribution network. It's at this point that the microgrid controller connects and disconnects to the larger grid. So moving to the next slide, with an understanding of what a microgrid is, we then summarize how and why microgrids are procured. Generally, the process starts with a feasibility study, then moves to engineering, design, and business planning, then to construction, and finally to operation and maintenance. While construction can occur very quickly, even in a matter of days, depending on the size of the project, the feasibility study and planning phases require substantial time and data, as these stages entail the majority of a customer's decisions about the microgrid's design. So designating critical loads, generation sources, interconnection, and control systems are key elements of these initial phases. Decisions around each element are heavily dependent on the characteristics of the customer, the local distribution system, if there is one, and the area in which the potential microgrid is to be located, as well as the customer's overarching objectives and their key motivations for procuring a microgrid. So moving to the next slide, why might a customer decide to procure a microgrid? We noticed 4 main motivations: increased reliability and resilience, decreasing electricity costs, expanding access to clean energy or assisting in the integration of clean energy resources, and providing power to remote, rural, or island communities. These customer motivations are not mutually exclusive. In fact, customers often have multiple motivations for installing a microgrid. This paper cites numerous examples of operational microgrids across the country that represent one or more of these objectives. So moving to the next slide, for each objective, we included 2 case studies of operating microgrids in the US. I won't go into all 8 of these in consideration of time, but I just wanted to highlight 2 during this presentation. So first, the Blue Lake Rancheria project in California. Our Microgrid State Working Group hosted a webinar in January that covered this project. It's located in a rural tribal community about 300 miles north of San Francisco. So this community experiences outages driven by both weather events like rainstorms and forest fires. And it also experiences public safety power shutoffs, during which California utilities cut off power to transmission and distribution lines under weather conditions that raise the risk of wildfires, with somewhere in between a few hours to a few days of advance notice. So this microgrid uses a solar array, battery storage, and control systems to allow the connected facilities, which include a casino, restaurants, hotel, convenience store and gas station, and a government office building, to operate in parallel with or islanded from PG&E's grid. The microgrid is capable of operating for more than 7 days in islanded mode. This project cost approximately $6.3 million up front, $5 million of which was funded by a grant from the California Energy Commission via the Electric Program Investment Charge. The microgrid provides approximately $200,000 in annual electricity savings for the tribe, and it reduces greenhouse gas emissions by about 160 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. The key lesson from this project was that microgrids can deliver stacked benefits, including energy cost savings, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and enhanced resilience, not just for energy services, but also interdependent lifeline sectors such as water, transportation, food, and communication. And second, I wanted to mention one of the rural community microgrid case studies located in Kodiak Island, Alaska, shown on the right. In researching some possible case studies for this paper, I learned that Alaska has been a leader in developing renewable microgrids. Alaska benefits from abundant wind and hydropower resources, and due to its vast land area and the dispersion of Alaskan communities, constructing microgrids is often more cost-effective than extending transmission and distribution wires from larger centralized power plants. On average, Alaskan households pay nearly $3,000 per year for energy, second only to Hawaii, which is another engine of microgrid development, and experiences some of the same opportunities and challenges as Alaska. In addition, the cost and difficulty of transporting diesel and natural gas makes renewable generation and energy storage compelling options for many Alaskan communities. Alaska's State Energy Office, the Alaska Energy Authority, has worked with the Department of Energy, national labs, and state and industry partners to facilitate microgrid deployment across the state. The University of Alaska Fairbanks actually estimates that 12% of the world's renewable microgrids are located in Alaska. One of these projects is the Kodiak Island microgrid, which we read about in this report. It's comprised of 9 megawatts of wind turbines, 3 megawatts of lead-acid batteries, and 2 megawatts of flywheel storage. This microgrid provides energy cost savings of approximately $4 million per year to the 15,000 island residents, and it has even enabled some customers to switch from oil heating to electric heat pumps. So moving to the next slide. A customer considering a microgrid will have to decide how to design the project to fit their needs. Our paper explores 6 key decision points and discusses some of the factors that a typical customer would consider. So first, designating critical loads and energy efficiency investment options, classifying loads across 4 tiers of prioritization, and accounting for opportunities to reduce energy needs through pre-microgrid efficiency measures. Sandia National Laboratories offers a 4-tiered system for classifying load. These terms were initially developed for U.S. Department of Defense facilities, but they can be extended to cover other microgrid customers. Tier 1 refers to non-interruptible critical load that must be powered at all times. Tier 2 refers to interruptible priority load that should ideally be powered at all times, but can be temporarily interrupted during a disruptive event. During islanded operations, Tier 1 load is always served, and Tier 2 load may be served as necessary and feasible by the microgrid. Tier 3 load is non-essential that will not be powered during islanded microgrid operations, and Tier 4 includes loads that are too small to justify the cost of automation and connection to the microgrid, and therefore would not be connected. An example might be streetlights. Second, considering a microgrid that connects to multiple facilities and/or across multiple meters and public rights-of-way, recognizing that multi-facility microgrids do add costs and complexity, but may deliver additional benefits. Third, selecting generation and storage resources, accounting for federal and state policies incentivizing renewable generation, combined heat and power, and biofuels, the reliability of liquid or gas fuel delivery, and the availability of on-site fuel storage, the availability and reliability of wind and solar resources, and environmental considerations. Fourth, considering some of the cost drivers, such as retail electricity rates in the microgrid's service area, energy export prices, non-wires alternatives, and access to competitive energy services markets. Fifth, selecting software, inverters, communication, and control systems, considering the impact of these systems on the microgrid's capabilities and overall costs. And finally, exploring interconnection options and considering where and how to interconnect to the distribution grid in order to minimize added costs. And the next slide has a graphical representation of some of these decision points written out into questions that a microgrid customer would typically ask during this process. So going to the next slide, NARUC used a tool from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab called DERCAM, which stands for Distributed Energy Resource Customer Adoption Model. We used DERCAM to model the 4 microgrid objectives discussed above. So DERCAM is free and publicly available. You're welcome to go and try to learn how to use it and play with it yourself. The user of DERCAM defines inputs such as loads and site data, utility tariffs, energy export options, and DER options. The model then runs a base case without new DER investments. Then it defines investment options for DER additions, and then it runs investment cases to find the optimal suite of DERs. So NARUC utilized DERCAM's built-in databases of building types, solar resources, and utility information. We selected an appropriate location and building type for each objective. There are other free tools like the National Renewable Energy Lab's Renewable Energy Integration and Optimization, or REOPT tool, as well as the Electric Power Research Institute's Distributed Energy Resources Value Estimation tool, or DERVET. But we felt that DERCAM was best suited to our needs for this paper. So moving to the next slide. This is a figure from the Clean Energy Integration use case as an example of the outputs that we received from DERCAM. For this use case, we selected a public school building located in Maryland. DERCAM indicated that an 800 kilowatt solar PV system, a larger storage installation, and controllable HVAC load would be an optimal solution. I do want to note here that for each DERCAM run, NARUC enabled the considerations of all types of DER technologies included in the model except for electricity discharged from electric vehicles, as well as at least 5 discrete backup generators with capacities appropriate to serve the building's load. Of course, an actual microgrid customer would have more information and knowledge about what types of DER technologies would be technically and financially feasible for their facilities, and they might wish to exclude some DER options. But in this hypothetical exercise, we wanted to cast a broader net and include everything that was available. So moving to the next slide, DERCAM also indicates how the optimal solution would operate during a typical day. And this graph shows how the building would purchase, generate, and sell electricity on a weekday in September. The dashed line shows the total original electric load. The yellow shading represents solar PV on-site consumption, which provides up to 600 kilowatts at peak. The pink line shows the state of charge of the battery storage, and the pink and bluish-gray shading shows when storage is discharged, somewhat in the morning hours and then more towards the end of the day. The green shading shows when the school purchases electricity from the utility. So this figure demonstrates that this optimal solution displaces the majority of the electricity that the school previously purchased from the utility prior to installing this microgrid. On this day, the solar PV went entirely towards on-site consumption and charging battery storage. However, on days in which load was lower, the school might have excess PV generation that could be exported and sold to the local distribution utility, which would provide another source of revenue. So moving to the next slide, we received several comments from reviewers about specifying the payback period of a microgrid investment. The optimal solutions modeled above demonstrate the feasibility of customer-sited microgrids to achieve some of these objectives with payback periods of between 16 and 20 years. The length of each payback period generally depends on on-site energy consumption and spending, how much energy is generated from the microgrid, the upfront capital costs of the microgrid, and the funding or financing arrangements. Customers installing microgrids are diverse, and there is significant variation in financial arrangements, ownership and operational structures, and interaction between the microgrid and the local distribution utility where a utility is present. My NASEO colleague Sam, in the next part of the presentation, will discuss these funding and financing arrangements. So moving to the next slide. Because this paper was written as part of the Microgrid State Working Group, we conclude with some takeaways and recommendations for public utility commissions and state energy offices to consider to address barriers to microgrid adoption. First, clarifying the regulatory treatment of microgrids by developing state-specific definitions reflective of jurisdictional characteristics, needs, and challenges. Multi-customer microgrids are particularly hindered by regulatory uncertainty. This is a topic that we've explored through the working group and will continue to discuss. Ensuring the consistent treatment of microgrids will remove some of this uncertainty and enable fair consideration of microgrids alongside other energy investments. Second, encourage the provision of transparent and current interconnection information to facilitate the timely and cost-effective interconnection process for microgrid customers. Several states employ pre-application reports that offer information to prospective interconnection applicants. States might consider other strategies to help streamline and speed the interconnection process. Third, continue to discuss and advance methodologies to value the full range of benefits that microgrids and individual DERs can offer, particularly around energy resilience. Many public utility commissions and state energy offices are already considering definitions and valuation methodologies for resilience that more fully account for the impacts of interruptions in energy service, particularly those driven by high-impact, low-frequency events. These efforts are generally outcome-based and not specific to any type of energy resource, which supports a more robust cost-benefit analysis process that will reflect more of the benefits provided by both microgrids and other resilience investment options. And fourth, facilitate productive engagement between microgrid adopters and community and stakeholder groups to identify opportunities for microgrids to provide greater energy, socioeconomic, and/or environmental benefits to both connected customers and the surrounding community. Customers and states have supported a number of microgrids that provide a higher level of benefits when multiple parties are involved in development. So with an understanding of why and how microgrids are procured and designed, we'll then move to discussing the paper on how microgrids are paid for. Before I turn things over, on behalf of both NARUC and NASEO, I really want to thank all of the Microgrid State Working Group members who took the time to review earlier drafts of these reports and provided us with really helpful feedback. And of course, I also want to thank the DOE Office of Electricity for funding the Microgrid State Working Group. So we hope these briefing papers and the virtual and in-person events that we've done in the first 18 months of the working group serve as strong building blocks for the work we'll be doing in the future. So with that, I think we'll save questions for the end, and I'll pass things over to Sam.
Great, thanks so much, Kira. That was a really great presentation. I think it kind of sets the stage nicely for my presentation as well. So you got to hear about, a lot of the why the microgrids are useful, but not, how to actually get from A to B, and financing is a big point. So what we want to do today is I have a few things I want to talk about as part of the presentation. First, why should we fund or finance microgrids to begin with? It's always good to talk about, the why before the how in this case. And then we'll talk about some of the cost drivers and some of the different revenue streams that microgrids can produce that can enable, financing to take place. And we'll talk about a number of models that exist at the state and local level and in the private sector that can be leveraged to support microgrid development, including a couple federal options for funds as well. And then we'll focus on, some of the actions that states and state energy officials and public utility commissioners can take in order to support the regulatory groundwork for microgrid funding and financing. So if we can go to the next slide. So I think Kira did a really nice job of talking about a lot of this, but obviously she talked a lot about a lot of the why you'd be interested, why a state or local government would be interested in building out a microgrid in the first place. And really the key here is that they provide reliable and consistent power to critical infrastructure in a state or locality. So obviously they're very appealing, but on the other hand, microgrids can cost millions of dollars to complete and to operate and maintain. So there's a lot of money there. They're very capital intensive investments. And because states generally always have limited capital budgets available to spend and many different competing priorities, obviously it's hard to just put money out there and just to fund a lot of microgrids if they're going to cost a lot of money when you have a lot of other things to do. So in order to get around that, states need to find ways to leverage their limited capital budgets in order to actually meet the goals they want to do. And so financing allows states to do that by borrowing, either from public capital or bringing in private capital into the mix to help fund it, or microgrid construction, and then just pay that capital back over the course of several years. And lately, there are a number of different mechanisms that have been leveraged by states to construct microgrids, and we'll kind of go through a few examples of each of them here. So we've talked about the why. Now let's start thinking about the how. So we go to the next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is, I mentioned earlier that microgrids are obviously very capital intensive. What we've done in this paper is we've broken down some of the expenses into different categories. Kira laid out the four stages of microgrid construction operation in the previous paper. I'm going to kind of dig into these a little bit in terms of some of the costs and where some of these costs are being driven. So first, obviously, is the feasibility study, which helps look at the area of, where would we want to site a microgrid? What potential customers would be served? What sort of load would it take? Would it sell to the grid? Things like that. There's a lot of evaluation of different things that go in there, including some of the potential revenue streams. Obviously, the firm that does this for the state or local government is going to have its own costs associated with completing the study. So that's going to be a driver, not a very big one, but it is important because it's early on in the process. The second is actually going to the technical engineering design of the microgrid, which usually involves an engineering firm, and that firm is going to come with its own costs. The costs from the firm are not insignificant. They can be up to 4 to 10% of total costs for the entire microgrid process. Then we go to construction, which is where we actually build the microgrid. And this can include not only equipment, but also labor in order to make the microgrid go from conception to reality. So the biggest share of costs here is definitely going to be procuring generation, and that can include traditional generation such as diesel generators, and then also combined heat and power, but then also renewable sources like solar and battery storage. Additionally, these soft costs that include, labor and transactional costs can be pretty expensive here and cost between 10 and 45% of the entire project, depending on how the microgrid is construed and designed. Finally, once you have the microgrid up and running, you need to make sure it's maintained so that it's going to be able to provide you the power you need. So the costs associated with this include any sort of routine or unexpected maintenance issues or replacement of different components of the microgrid as they exceed their useful lives. So we've got different cost drivers here, and the question is all these together are make a microgrid an expensive value proposition. Fortunately, though, the microgrids also have opportunities to provide their own sources of revenue to help make up for some of those costs. If we can go to the next slide, we've got a number of revenue streams. If you click a bunch of times, Kirsten, they should all pop up one by one. And I don't want to touch on all of these in the interest of time. We do touch on them more in the paper. A couple of things I wanted to touch on. One is a distribution support service agreement. I think that's a little bit more of a newer term that you may not be familiar with. It's basically a long-term agreement between a microgrid and a utility that allows the utility to request the help of a microgrid to support its grid operations, especially in either normal conditions or black sky conditions. And basically that helps increase the resiliency of the entire grid, since the utility can call upon the microgrid services when needed. And the microgrid is able to procure a specific amount of revenue from the utility as a result of being on standby or being used by the, as part of the utility's larger grid system. The other one that's interesting in mentioning, and this is kind of an up and coming thing, is the potential of using flood insurance premiums. A lot of, if microgrids are constructed and can help make areas in flood-prone regions a little bit more resilient, there is a potential to actually leverage the insurance premiums from that to support a little bit of microgrid revenue. The point is that there are a lot of different revenue streams out there that microgrids can take advantage of, and savvy designers should really kind of look into utilizing as many of these streams as they can, within reason, in order to really kind of develop a sustainable revenue stream that can really pay for much of the microgrid. So now that we've talked about the different revenue streams a little bit that microgrids can bring to the table, now let's talk about a few financing options that can take advantage and leverage those revenue streams in order to actually fund construction of the microgrid. So in terms of leveraging private capital, we've got three general options here that states and local governments have leveraged, and the private sector have leveraged to construct microgrids. So they're energy as a service, energy savings performance contracts, and then also commercial property assessed clean energy, or CPACE. If we go to the next slide. Great. So with energy as a service is a pay-for-performance model that basically uses the energy savings from the microgrid to pay for the project upgrades. It is currently considered to be an off-balance sheet transaction for accounting purposes, but it is also a very complex transaction. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see that there is a graph that shows, or a chart that shows you how all the interactions that go into an energy as a service agreement. And obviously there are a lot of parties involved, and each party has specific roles. It can be a very complex transaction, which means that the actual transaction costs are going to be a little bit higher than for some of the other options. It's also used almost exclusively right now by the private sector, so it's something that we haven't seen a lot of use in public buildings. Part of the reason for that is that there is a third party that comes in and makes all the improvements, also owns the improvements, and that can be problematic for tax purposes and for actually financing some of the building improvements. Especially if you have debt out on the building, if you've got some of the improvements owned by a third party, that can be very problematic. So a lot of states and localities have kind of looked elsewhere. That doesn't mean it hasn't ever happened. The big example of this is in Montgomery County. Their public safety headquarters was outfitted with a microgrid as a combination between the county, Duke Energy Renewables, and Schneider Electric. Also, the other thing to note about this is that there is no guarantee of energy savings, unlike the next model. If we go to the next page. So the next model, energy savings performance contracts, or ESPCs. A lot of you may have heard of these, at least in passing. But this is basically where a customer contracts out with an energy services company, or an ESCO, in order to contract out for a specific level of guaranteed savings. The ESCO will contract with the customer to guarantee that amount of savings. The ESCO goes in and makes improvements to a building or several buildings, depending on the contract, to meet the agreed level of savings. If the level of savings achieved by the building does not meet the savings guaranteed by the ESCO will either install additional maintenance mechanisms or cut a check to cover the difference. So ESPC can actually be leveraged if you have enough areas for savings to build in other improvements, such as microgrids. We've seen this in several locations done by the Department of Defense, especially the Navy has done multiple building and multiple structure microgrids for some of its bases in Portsmouth and also in New London in Connecticut. So that's something that the Department of Defense has definitely been utilizing in order to construct microgrids to improve the resiliency of bases. If we go to the final one, next slide, to the final public-private option. There we go. CPACE. CPACE is often used to either fill in financing gaps in a capital stack for buildings that are getting ready to be retrofitted or constructed in many states. A lot of states do have CPACE available at this point, and many states do have active programs, which is great. But it can also help cover, use the energy savings to cover the cost of installing microgrids. Typically, this is going to be used for single building microgrids as opposed to campus or community microgrids connecting multiple structures. We see this, there is a building in Hartford, Connecticut that actually installed a single building microgrid. They have yet to use it, but a lot of the building's tenants really have sensitive power needs and appreciate the resiliency that is provided by the microgrid in that building. So CPACE has been successfully used for microgrids. If we go to the next slide, I've touched on a few things in terms of bringing in private capital, but I also really want to make sure we're talking about the role of public funding in microgrid projects. So we talked earlier about the 4 different pieces of the microgrid, and those pieces that are kind of at the beginning stage, the feasibility study and the actual technical design are usually the early stages in the microgrid when developers and local governments or states are not quite sure about what the revenue streams for the microgrid would look like and how the microgrid would generate revenue. And so this makes it a little bit more challenging for private financiers to say at this point, we're comfortable with backing this project. But you need to kind of get to the point where you can develop the actual design in order for private financiers to understand where the revenue is going to come from. So in order to get to that, a lot of states have begun using grant funding in order to provide support for microgrid design in the early design stages. So through the feasibility study and the technical design phases, since they cover the costs of the firms doing the studies, and also make it so private financiers that are maybe working with the local government have a better understanding of what actually is going to come out of this and what their rates of return would look like. So grants are actually really great at helping seed the microgrids. The problem is that they're only sustainable as long as you keep getting money. You don't get grant back from when you've done spending it. Once it's gone, it's gone. So unless you have the money that keeps coming from the legislature or wherever you're getting it from, you're not gonna be able to do a grant program indefinitely. So some states have also kind of looked at other capital options such as pure financing through state revolving loan funds or state-sponsored green banks that can help kind of provide low-cost financing to help fill in the gaps and help get folks from the idea of a microgrid to actually constructing a microgrid as well. It is a little bit more difficult for the folks designing a microgrid to attract finance until later in the process, so public capital can help fill that gap. We go to the next slide. There are a number of different programs that states can use to help support the development of microgrids. So we list 6 of them here. In the interest of time, I won't go through any of them too much, but I'll try and touch on 1 or 2 highlights for each. If you'd like additional information, there will be more information in the report on each one of these options. So the first one we like to look at is state energy revolving loan funds. Most states in the nation have at least one revolving loan fund. While these were started in the 80s using petroleum violation escrow funds in Nebraska and Texas, these really kind of took off in the ERA years, and most of them actually use ERA funding right now. So these are always useful to use because the energy offices and or utility commissioners generally have stronger familiarity with these types of programs since they've been around for a while, and or they are directly managed by the energy office themselves. One of the advantages they can do is they can offer below market rate financing, which is fantastic in the long run. If you can get financing for, say, 1% interest rate as opposed to 3 or 4 in the private sector, it's going to save you a lot of money over the course of the contract. The only challenge here is that since a lot of these revolving loan funds were funded with ARA money, that means that Davis-Bacon, Buy American, and our reporting provisions do apply to these loan funds. This can potentially increase their transaction costs and also and make it a little bit more challenging for folks to utilize that money. But it is one strong option for funding microgrids. If we go to the next slide. A lot of states have started thinking about using grant and incentive programs, again, like I said earlier, to try and get microgrids through those early stages so they can actually get to the point where they can become an attractive proposition for private capital. New Jersey has been doing this with a several stage process in terms of getting town center microgrids set up, where they provided some funding for 13 different town center microgrids to do feasibility studies, and then they provide additional funding for designs selected to do some additional technical design work in order to help get these local governments involved in thinking about how to do the microgrids, and then helping to get financial providers involved with how to fund these microgrids as well. If we go to the next slide. Another one is that a lot of states have begun exploring the option of developing a green bank. So I think it's something like 23 states are in the various stages of the exploration process for a green bank. I believe it's about 10 states that have green banks right now. These green banks can be a wonderful source of gap financing to help fill in the gaps and make additional loans to cover the cost of a microgrid. The most prominent example we have is the Connecticut Green Bank's Microgrid Financing Program that has made a couple loans to support microgrid build-outs in Connecticut. I believe City of Bridgeport was one microgrid that used their program. If we go to the next slide. Green bonds are another example. Municipalities, if they have the ability to, are able to and can borrow and use this new class of bond in order to help fund projects that have an environmental or a clean energy scope to them. It's a relatively novel solution, but we are seeing a couple of examples out there of microgrids being funded with this. One of the more prominent examples is also New Jersey. It's in Camden County. It's a microgrid that connects the town with a wastewater treatment plant as well. It's a really interesting case study, and I'm looking forward to seeing the microgrid once it's completed and how the bond is actually structured. We go to the next slide. There's also the way of doing competitive grants, where the state sets criteria in order to release grants to certain participants who meet the criteria of the state. It's a great way for the state to get its own personal preferences out there in terms of what kinds of microgrids it wants to see on its grid. The New York Prize microgrid competition is the most prominent example of this approach. If we go to the next slide. And finally, there is the option of just having the utility own and develop microgrids. The distinct advantage here is that the utility knows where best it can place microgrids to support its overall grid functions. So there is certainly a case to be made here for utility-owned microgrids, and that they can be optimized for siting, as opposed to having third parties put microgrids in that work the best for their customers, but may not be the most optimal spot on the grid for to provide support services. But there also have been some questions with public utility commissions around whether or not utilities want to own microgrids. This can certainly be another issue in states that are restructured, where utilities are not allowed to own generation, and how is that treated? There are also potential questions around the cross-subsidization of different microgrid customer classes if the microgrid customers do go off grid. And one of the big examples we've highlighted in this paper is the Bronzeville microgrid that is in Illinois. The next slide, please. So there are a couple of options here for federal funding for microgrids. FEMA has two of these with its BRIC program as well as its hazard mitigation grant program. And HUD also has potential to fund microgrids as part of their community development block grant funds for disaster relief. Just want to quickly touch on those. We go to the next slide. So this is the final slide. This is the so what slide, you know, and so Sam, why did you just tell us all this information? And so why I told you this is because you as energy officials and public utility commissioners have a lot of different actions you can take to really support and develop regulatory frameworks that make funding and financing microgrids easy and accessible for developers, for customers, for local governments, for whoever in your state wants to build microgrids. And these can involve either kind of building out new rate structures that microgrids can use to develop predictable revenue streams, supporting microgrid development with public funding at key points in the microgrid development process, especially in those early stages like we talked about earlier, enabling public-private capital financing options. Not every state has CPACE, not every state has an active CPACE program. You know, those are low-hanging fruit opportunities. Making sure you have a strong energy saving performance contracting program is always great. We've got several states with the energy offices that do a good job there. Providing additional comprehensive technical assistance and support for customers that are thinking about different financing options. Energy offices in particular are great at providing education and getting stakeholders together for convening to talk about some of these issues. And then also, you know, with the Public Utility Commission expressing support and for regulatory certainty, a lot of folks are a little bit less sure about how to move forward with microgrids if they're not exactly sure what the regulatory landscape is. The Public Utility Commission can really help with that. And finally, for both energy offices and utility commissions, making sure that, you know, finding ways to empower underserved communities is always a bonus and something that both of these entities are particularly well suited to do to make sure that everybody benefits from microgrids and not just certain folks. So if we go to the next slide, I believe it's time for Q&A. So I will turn things back over to Kirsten and she will help lead us through the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kira and Sam. This was a great presentation, really helpful and really good overview of the papers. We did get a few questions in, so I'm just gonna kind of summarize them. The first few questions are on the first paper for Kira. So this is about DERCAM, and one of the questions was, A, could you please tell us a little bit about how DERCAM optimizes greenhouse gas reduction and economics? And then there was also a question on if the value of resilience is baked into the Performer DERCAM structure.
Sure. So on that first question about optimizing greenhouse gas reduction, at the beginning of running DERCAM, you can select optimizing either for economics or optimizing for carbon emissions. However, even if you are optimizing for carbon emissions, you still have to meet some user-defined payback constraints. And in its outputs, DERCAM also includes avoided CO2 emissions or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So if you can attach a social cost of carbon, or if you have a state or local metric for avoided emissions, that could aid in cost effectiveness analysis if you're comparing a microgrid with other investment options or comparing different microgrid investment options. For more detail on DERCAM, I'd recommend checking out their website. I'll put the link in the chat here. They have a number of really good educational resources that kind of walk you through how the model works and the choices that users can make to make it a valuable tool. On that second question on the value of resilience within DERCAM, the model lets users specify a number of outage days per year, and you can also input a value of lost load during those interruptions. Of course, coming up with a robust value of lost load that really reflects the cost of an outage is difficult, and this is really at the heart of the difficulty in defining and valuing resilience, particularly for some of these longer duration outages. So for this paper, we used another tool from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, the Interruption Cost Estimator, or the ICE calculator, and I'll put that one in the chat as well. The ICE calculator relies on customer willingness to pay surveys that were conducted by utilities over several decades. So we thought it was a good tool, but again, this is a hypothetical exercise on our part, so we tried to make use of existing tools to come up with sort of approximate values for some of the objectives that we were trying to model, but we certainly recognize that these are imperfect and require some site-specific data. and wouldn't necessarily be the same as what a individual site itself might come up with. I think there was also a question on heat pumps and whether those are included in DIRCM. I am not sure if that's an explicit option. It's not an explicit option that you can turn on or off or include or exclude from consideration. But DIRCM does include controllable heating load as a investment option. So I would think that heat pumps would be included in that category. But I would have to check into some of the documentation and resources that LBNL has available to make sure.
Great, thank you, Kira. Sam, on the financing side, you looked at a few different microgrids that use different financing options, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how each of them decided to use these financing options and if they considered other financing options.
Sure. So we did look at a lot of these, and it really comes down to a combination of what options the regulatory system in a state allows to do. You know, like I mentioned earlier, not every state has the ability to use CPACE because either it's not enabled or they don't have an active program yet in their state. So that obviously takes one option off the table. It really depends on the comfort level of different options. The U.S. Navy went with energy savings performance contract. That kind of contract has been around for 30 years. It's something that DoD has used on many bases in order to provide improvements. So it was kind of a natural step. Energy as a service is certainly one that's more cutting edge, but you know, it took a lot of conversations in Montgomery County between the county and Schneider and Duke to really kind of move this forward in terms of how it would be structured and how each party would be compensated as a result of the microgrid and the revenue streams it was able to generate. I believe in large part through the sale of SREX and also power back to the grid in Maryland. So the idea, which option a developer or local government or the customer wants to use is kind of dependent on a number of factors. And so it's really most useful for everyone to kind of take a look at what the landscape is for your state and what you're going to be able to do and what you're going to be able to take advantage of. Certain states are going to have programs like, you know, like microgrid grant programs like New Jersey or New York, and certain states are going to have loan funds that can be able to lend for these things. You know, it takes some thought and some effort, but you know that it can kind of help folks really understand their options better and then move forward with the right mix of financing options that are going to suit their microgrid best.
Great, thank you. We also had another question on the financing paper. Was wondering if you could provide any thoughts, Sam, about how ancillary services provided by the microgrid could be compensated.
Sure. I mean, I think it depends on the type of arrangement the microgrid sets with the utility and what they're allowed to be compensated for by the commission. I mean, you know, microgrids can and have been compensated for services like providing inertial response, reactive power, voltage control, and then also operating reserves. But again, it depends on what arrangement the utility is looking for and what the microgrid is actually allowed to do. So it really depends on the state's regulatory regime as to, you know, what services the microgrid can provide to get compensated by and how much the utility values those services.
Great. Thank you. One question came in that I think could be for both of you, Kira and Sam, and that is if you're kind of reflecting on the recent events in Texas and the Midwest where, you know, severe weather events caused a lot of outages, reliability and resilience problems, how would you envision microgrid technology maybe addressing some of these issues? And, you know, in terms of the resilience, maybe for Kira, and for Sam, how is there anything in terms of financing then that changes the equation, or would the same kind of structure still hold?
Sure, I can start with some observations. So it is a little bit soon after the events in Texas to be able to kind of draw any lessons. I know people are starting to come together and discuss exactly what happened, why, and what we can do to prevent things in the future. So without trying to weigh in on those issues too much, I think microgrids were absolutely a part of the response in Texas. I did hear from a microgrid provider that installs both solely natural gas powered microgrids and natural gas and renewable microgrids, and their natural gas service had firm contracts, so they were actually able to keep service going during the cold weather events. I know there was some issues with gas scarcity and power plants unable to get reliable supply of natural gas, and some issues with the gas distribution network. But that was not a problem for this particular microgrid provider. So, I think they absolutely can be part of the solution, and hopefully we'll get some more data on how microgrids and other resources performed during the emergency. I think also, Texas really gives us a good opportunity to look at, what do people do during an emergency when the power goes out? Where do they go? Where can we be, better locating microgrids that really provide energy services to the community during an outage? And how can we, reduce some of the harmful impacts and detrimental effects of losing power for a number of days? So, we'll certainly pay attention to studies and after action reports that come out of Texas. Hopefully it's a good learning opportunity for us and something that we can use to kind of better understand how microgrids can be deployed.
Great, I agree with you there, Kira. And I think what kind of reflecting on Texas, what this has kind of shown, obviously, is it seems like microgrids down there had a pretty good success rate in terms of providing power to their key constituents, and there is an incredible value there in terms of having the ability to keep those lights on in a situation such as what was experienced, through ERCOT and from all the consumers in Texas. But it shines even more light on the fact that we've yet to really come to a consensus on how we value resiliency and how we value the resiliency services of these microgrids. And this would arguably be maybe the biggest potential funding source for a microgrid if we can actually figure out how to accurately value this, because if you can monetize the benefits of resiliency, because there's a clear benefit to the customers that had microgrids during the last cold snap. But the question is at how much and how much should the microgrid be compensated? And if you can figure that out, and something a lot of states are starting to think about and work on, we can figure that out. It's going to end up really providing a solid foundation for microgrid financing, since once that's monetized, we can turn it into a revenue stream. We can have it provide specific amounts of compensation. So that's going to make capital providers a lot more comfortable with financing microgrids, and can really lead to stronger development not only in Texas, but in the rest of the nation, if we can actually get that problem solved.
Great, thank you so much. And we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I'm going to end the Q&A portion here, but I appreciate your presentations, Kira and Sam, and your reports, and thank you so much for giving us the presentation. I wanted to, before we conclude, have one more announcement for the Microgrid State Working Group. And as Kira and Sam mentioned, the microgrid topic is evolving, and we will see how some of these severe weather events or FERC Order 2222 are influencing some of these considerations for microgrids. So we have our next webinar on April 7th. It's from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time, with a half-hour members-only portion afterwards. The members-only portion will be a discussion with the Rhode Island Office of Energy Innovation, which is part of our working group. And but before we have the membership-only portion, we will talk about some of these natural disasters and severe weather events that have an impact on microgrids and on the electricity sector. And during the webinar, on April 7th, we will have SEPA present some of the findings that they've been working on with the Kentucky Energy Office on the recent studies that they did for Kentucky, how some of the microgrid deployment strategies can be implemented in Kentucky and have broader implications for other states to enhance resilience. So that will be a very timely topic, and I hope you can join us at 3 p.m. Eastern on April 7th. And I wanted to mention that that webinar and the webinar is funded by the Office of Electricity, but the SEPA Kentucky study is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy State Energy Program. So with that, thank you so much for attending this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us, Kira and Dominic at NARUC, and Sam and myself at NASEO, and we look forward to the April 7th webinar. And thank you again, Kira and Sam, for the great presentations today. Have a good one.
Thank you,
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you both, and have a great day, everybody.